Welcome to the Story Talks Back. Almost everything that we remember, think about, or imagine is a story. Stories entertain us, inform us, and even define us. They have upsides, and they have downsides. This podcast explores the power of story in every aspect of our lives. I'm Dave Stanton. Thank you for joining us. Ananda Lima's poetry collection, Motherland, published by Black Lawrence Press, won the 2020 Hudson Prize. She's also the author of the chapbooks Translation, winner of the Vella Chapbook Prize, Amblyopia, and Tropicália. Her work has appeared in the American Poetry Review, Poets.org, Kenyon Review Online, Gulf Coast, and other publications. She has an MA in Linguistics from UCLA and an MFA in Creative Writing in Fiction from Rutgers University, Newark. Okay. So Thank you for joining me, Ananda, for the Story Talks Back. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great.
So I wanted to start out by asking you about stories in your life, particularly stories in your childhood and growing up, and sort of the atmosphere that was around you when you were a kid. Do you have any sense of how important stories were back then?
Yeah, so preparing for this, like listening to past of this podcast, which I just loved, got me thinking about so many stories that were around, and I think that's true of everybody. For me, I'll talk about a few of them. One is my family is very, very big, like especially my mom's family. She had 9 siblings. So it was a lot of people, and they each had, 3, 4 kids. And they were very close, they are still very close. I'm just here, but they're very close. So we would meet up a lot. So a lot of the first stories that I heard were partial stories, because they were not, especially my mom, they were not parents that would go, let me tell you a story about my childhood. They would not do that. But mostly I got stories of them joking with each other. So it was mostly like, remember that time that you did this? And it was kind of like partial. And there was a lot of like private jokes that they had with each other. And we would sort of pick up the vibe and pieces of it and sort of build it over the years. And I was thinking about that. And as a reader, I'm very tolerant of having to sort of hang with it for a bit until I get the story. And I think that was a good beginning for it. maybe it brings me back to that. And because there were 9 of them, it's sort of like you get different perspectives on the same event, and little bits here and there, and one bit here and one bit years later. So I think that was a very great experience. Other stories, I think I a lot of my memories from Brazil, like I've been living here for a couple of out of Brazil for a couple of decades. So I don't know how it is now, because we didn't have, like, not a lot of people had cable and stuff like that. It was just, especially the people I knew, it was just what is on the official channels. And the soap operas just sort of dominated everybody's lives, right? So everybody watched them. Everybody knew what was going on. Everybody knew the format, right? And the stories in the soap opera were really a common thread on everybody. So it was, I didn't know anybody who didn't know what was going on in the soap operas. So, that gave me a very different type of storytelling, right? Throughout my childhood, that is very threaded. is very sort of, there's very clear expectations of what's going to happen. You know, even if you might not know a detail or two, you know, kind of the progression of how that story is going to go. Another thing that experience gave me is just to see the power. So fashions, things that people are saying, that all sort of came from the soap opera. So it was very, it really influenced people's lives. You know, it really penetrated people's lives. At the same time, I was also exposed to American movies, right? So like as many people in the world. So we watched a lot of the movies that, you know, were out, I don't know, in the 80s here. I watched them again and again because I watched the public television, and they bought the movie, they dubbed it with the same actors, right? Like it's the same voices for all the movies. and and they would repeat it again and again and again. So they would run it once at night, like the big premiere, right? And then in the afternoon they would repeat for years. So we would watch the movies many times. um so I had all these stories that I think now they sort of come out in different ways in my work. I think another thread that was a story that was a sort of constant stream of story for me was, so I grew up in Brasilia, the capital, and I was kind of the first generation ish born there, right? So Brasilia was a planned city, and it was at the time when they decided it was mostly farmland. There were, you know, um, those huge farms in the 60s, in the 50s, 60s. So people moved there to build the city. Then people moved to work there, and that was my parents. And then uh, I was the first generation born there. So there were lots of stories about sort of the grand feat that it was building that city, you know, and also stories from homeland. So pretty much everybody's parents were migrants. So it
Uh-huh.
was a very big mix of stories that that I sort of grew up with constantly in my life.
It's funny because, Brazil still has these soap operas, these
Yeah.
incredible stories that everybody
Yeah.
knows, and that's something that used to be true here, but now that, there's so much fragmentation of people's
Right.
media that um, people are not having that same sense of a shared story that's still going on in Brazil today.
Right.
Do you think that that has some kind of an effect on the culture or the people?
Yeah. So I think looking at it all together, right? Like not just the soap opera or whatever that specific story, but the sort of fragmentation of realities, you know, as we we are sort of witnessing, has a big impact, right? You
Right.
have such different, so when you put it all together, that is not just one thing, but all the media that people are consuming is becoming fragmented. So I think it's very destabilizing, right? You just go, how can this person think this way? But there's so much that goes into how you think, right? So it is, it, when it's very extreme like that, I think you can really see it. Um, and I think we lived through it getting to where it is now, right? Um, I think, but even subtly, having this common story um, makes the mass experience more shareable, right? And there's good aspects of it and there's bad aspects of it, I think, as well. I think when I grew up in Brazil, and I say like when I grew up in Brazil like that, it may be all the same again, but um, I'll get into that in a minute. But I'm not living there now, and I think so many things changed recently that I sometimes go, I don't know if it's like that anymore. Um, but uh, but I think there was when I moved overseas, I felt, oh, I thought in a way that was so uniform. I think it's the small town experience, right?
Right.
um,
Right.
Even though I wasn't in a small town, but I think part of the soap opera, it was great because we had this shared story, and it was it's a very nice thing to build community and to sort of connect with people, but also having this because I think stories are powerful. Having this one story that everybody sort of is attached to is also has negative effects, I think.
Hmm.
Um,
What would that be?
but I think, and again, not just looking at the soap opera, but just the uniform belief system, right? Um, it's just closed-mindedness or thinking that things have to be a certain way. Um,
Hmm.
all, I don't know, prejudice, all this stuff. I think when you think that reality has to be is one way, right? Um, and that leads to intolerance, I think, of anything that deviates from that picture.
I see.
Um, yeah. Um, yeah. Now, with the not knowing how things are now, I feel like when I talk about, oh yes, there's this intolerance, right? Um, that I felt like my experience was the small town person, even though I wasn't in a small town, I was a city person. But when I moved different places, I was like, oh, things are different. It doesn't have to be this way. Um, but at the same time, I was there as a child and as a teenager, and I left. So for me, sometimes it's hard to distinguish what is like Brazil and what is like my family in Brazil. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Because everything that I experienced there was filtered through being sort of a minor that could
Uh-huh.
not go around and see everything. Um, and I think I've come to this realization more and more strongly now because my family just went they went like really crazy with the bad stuff that is happening in Brazil now.
Uh,
Um,
uh,
um, and I was like, who are these people? Have they always been like that? And have I not realized? you know, so it's all very questionable for me. Yeah,
it's
yeah.
interesting that you kind of reached just as you were reaching a stage where you could be independent and you could sort of make your own reality. You left the
Yeah.
country and you came to the US.
Exactly. And I came first to Australia,
That's right.
and then I came later to the
That's
US.
right.
But that's right. And, I think I used to, like, in Australia, I met some Brazilian people, but not as many as here. And they fit my picture of Brazil, the people I met there. And then here and over the years, I started meeting other people. I was like, no, maybe it's just the people I know in Brazil that think this way. You know what I mean? I needed my own expansion
Right.
because of what you just brought up. But it took a while because I just had a very specific experience of Brazil.
Do you have a sense
Yeah.
that there's a difference between Brazilian story and US story or Western story in terms
Yeah.
of narrative or what makes a good story?
Yeah. So I think one difference, right, is the which is in a way superficial, is the content of the narrative, right? So, America has its own America myths, and Brazil has its own Brazil myths. And I think this is superficial in that they're similar. They just say, one says America is great, the other one says Brazil is great, but they're similar in that those are just the grandiose stories that people tell about their countries. And I think it's true everywhere. But so this is content. So I feel that, especially because I sort of had history classes in Brazil, and then I have friends who had history classes here, and I go, wow, that's how it's presented. It's not presented this way over there, which also happens both ways. So one thing is content, but in terms of structure and that kind of thing. Now, I was thinking about that, and I think, first of all, I don't have the whole landscape. Like usually the stuff that I'm presented is presented through friends who know what's going on there. But I'll just talk about sort of literary landscape today, and then I'll talk about stories in a bigger picture. I feel like Brazilian publishing is not as professionalized as American publishing. So, like here, to publish a book, you first workshop it in classes, then you workshop it with your friends, then you send it to the agent, and the agent's gonna revise it. Then you send it to the editors, and they're going to revise it. So it's a very big effort, especially for sort of big house book.
Right.
Whereas in Brazil, I don't know, different presses, there's a lot of little presses, and different presses will have different levels of editing, and it's all sort of there mixed up in the same marketplace. So I feel like when I read Brazilian books, it's a little bit similar to the experience of reading small press books here, in that I find some wonderful stuff that would not fly, in a big publisher. Or maybe it will fly with difficulty. So I think I find this freedom, but I also find stuff that are like, oh, maybe it would be better if they didn't do this thing in the story, But I enjoy that very much. So I find that I find very beautiful, amazing surprises reading Brazilian books. But the same as small presses here, just because it doesn't go through so many filters, more interesting stuff stays. And you also find a lot of duds, because for the same reason. Now in storytelling, let me think. I think I wonder. I think there's a little bit more tolerance for not such tight plots.
What do you mean?
Okay, so I think I'm talking about publishing again. I think here, like the character does something, it should be driven by a character flaw, and this has to cause that, and everything is causally connected. I think there's a little bit more freedom on that for external events. But I'm not sure. Now, when we talk about sort of popular stories, like, and I'm most familiar sort of in the Northeast, because that's where my family's from Bahia. You have sort of cordel and this sort of stuff. I think there's a lot of recurring themes. The devil is very present as a trickster, which is very enjoyable. So I think you're gonna get a lot of little stories about the devil or about the traveler or whatever, and those you get the particular story, but it sort of links to a recurring theme. And that is part of the joy too. Even though it's not a serial thing, you sort of you revisit this type of character, which I think is very fun.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
also have, you have two cultures, and then you also have two languages, right? Which you kind of have the option at any moment of working with one or the other. So particularly, for your storytelling, but also in your poetry, what types of things do you find that you are more inclined to write in English as opposed to Portuguese? And is there a distinction?
Very nice. So I feel like, especially for fiction, I pretty much almost always write in English. And I think that's just because that's the language I'm embedded in, like that's the language that I live.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and um, and that comes very naturally, like to start in English. Um, Sometimes when the character is Brazilian and speaks, that's when the Portuguese comes in, and I either translate it or not, but mostly I translated. Um, and sort of that pulls the Portuguese. Um, there was this one story recently that I wrote in Portuguese, which was a total surprise for me. And I wrote the whole thing in Portuguese. Um,
Is it published?
and yeah, it's Antropófaga. Is
Right.
yeah, yeah. And but then I thought about it. Oh, that's because I started writing it when I was in Portugal for like a month. Then I was in Brazil for a month, and that's when I wrote it. So I'm like, okay, it makes sense. It's the language that I'm immersed in. But but I did notice that when I wrote that story, um, I think I wrote it differently. Um, I had more gaps when I wrote it in Portuguese. I had more jumps. I didn't um,
Hmm.
handhold the reader as much. Um,
Hmm.
even though in Portuguese, when I speak Portuguese, I use the pronouns. So I say, I went to the shop, right? But Portuguese, you can drop the pronoun and just say, went to the shop. Um, and in writing, people tend to drop the pronoun, because I think that's like the linguist speaking. Okay, in writing, when you read a book that like was published in Brazil, a lot of times they drop the pronouns more than when you talk to people on the street. And I think it's because it sounds literary,
Yeah.
because it's older. um Anyways, um but I did a little bit of that, and it was so much fun, because it creates so much ambiguity. You know, you can tell from context, but the sentence can be read in many ways, which is very enjoyable. That's one thing I love about Clarice Lispector when I'm reading.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you kind of know what she wants to say, but she's also saying all this other stuff, because of things like that, of dropping the pronoun or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, so I wrote that story differently, and it was much smaller in Portuguese. Now, when I translated it, it grew a lot, because I was like, no, let me get from A to B a little bit more. So it was a really great experience, but mostly I just write in English.
I mean,
um,
do you feel that, you know, the fact that you're sort of more expansive when you write in English is partly because you're explaining it to yourself, or because you don't
I love
feel
that
as
question.
comfortable?
I love that question. I'm thinking about that. Wow, that's cool. Like I think I'm going to think about that, because I never thought, am I explaining to myself? Um, Maybe that's what I'm doing. But I do feel more comfortable writing in English. And the
Hmm.
reason is, um, English has its things, like, let me just give a random example, like, don't end a sentence in a preposition or whatever. But people don't really care if in your story you end your sentence in a preposition. and it fits the character and the story. It's not like such a huge deal.
Sure.
In Brazil, even in the soap operas, like when I first come, like the first day I go back to Brazil and somebody turns on the soap opera, it's very artificial the way they speak, you know. So I think the gap, like, ele estava na loja, you know, like they don't cut the same way that you cut as you speak. It's very sort of heightened, even in the soap opera, which is a very popular medium. Now, when you get a book, a lot of the books, I feel like the gap between the way you speak and the way you write is a little wider there than it is here. Um, um, and sort of the grammar rules and stuff like that. So when I write in Portuguese, I'm kind of stressed out. You know, I'm like, is this incorrect? Is this correct? You know, I kind of have to write it in secret and, like, you know, more than in English, because in English it's like, oh, is this bad writing or whatever? But in Portuguese, on top of that, it's sort of like, is this proper? So I I actually have a much easier time writing in English, even if there are things that later I have to look at, you know. I'm less worried just because the written language in Brazil is so there's so much that goes in there, you know. It's a lot of sort of, I think the evolution of that is very sort of class based. There's a lot of weight on the way you write, you know. So I think that gets in there. I'm like, what is the right way? In English, what happens a lot is not big things. What happens a lot when I write in English is like, I don't know if it's on, in, or at, stuff like that. I'm like, is it on the thing, in the thing, or at the thing? So I just write it and then I ask my husband later, you know. I'm like, is little things like that. And then there's things I'm not aware of, and those don't get in the way. But I do like your question about explaining to myself. I wonder if I'm explaining to myself and to the reader. I think I have more of a burden to explain to the reader than I have to. Then I sort of explain to myself in the process in English, and I think that is both because of the thing that I was talking about how the books there's a wider variety of things you see published.
Yeah.
I think that is also part of me having been trained as a writer. So I wrote before, but here I went to the MFA, I went to workshops and things, and that has happened in English. Maybe they do the same thing there somewhere, but I didn't have that experience there. So I think in English, I put on all that knowledge comes,
Right.
you know.
You have that whole academic career
Right,
that's
right. And it was all
all
in English.
associated with English.
Exactly.
And that's
So it's
such
sort
a
of like,
formal, I mean, I was a copy editor for the Modern Language Association for
that's so
a
cool.
number of years. Actually, I was a proofreader more than a copy editor. And
Oh my gosh. So you're the person I should have been worried about when I was writing about the ons and ins and outs.
I probably wouldn't have noticed, but
Yeah.
I mean, that type of writing is very, very stilted in a way. It's very kind of
Right.
arch, you know, formal. Um, so
Right. Yeah. So because I came to the US to do a graduate program in linguistics, right? And we wrote these papers that was sort of very sort of formal style, right?
right,
Um, and it had a lot of sort of jargon that had very specific meanings. And if
right.
you are making a definition for something, you have to really work on it. And those papers in a way are sort of, they easier in the way that it can be boring. You know,
Right.
uh, you can make the reader suffer because they just want the information.
Because they
um,
deserve it.
yeah, they just, you gotta earn it. Um, of course, there's a couple of exceptions of people who write it very well. I could never do that for that type of paper.
Mm,
Um, but I have a very hard time with nonfiction. Like, I love writing fiction, I love writing poetry, but nonfiction for me is just like amazingly hard. And every once in a while, somebody asks you to write something like, if you're sending a poem for an anthology, sometimes they want a poem and a little essay about something related to the poem. Mine are always awful. I write very like, whoa, blah, blah, blah. And it's a very hard time for me, because
Interesting.
now you have to make it nice. You know, it can just be a boring thing. I have a very hard time. Um, yeah,
It's funny.
yeah, very different style.
It's funny because your fiction is in English and for the most part, and I found it also though that you seem more comfortable being kind of surreal or um, you know experimental in terms of your subject matter in fiction. And it's
Mm-hmm.
hard. I guess it's harder to be surreal in a poem, but um,
They're ready, so like out there. Yeah, yeah,
do you find
yeah,
that? I mean, it seems like you sort of there's almost kind of a science fiction element to it.
yeah, 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 yeah. That's so true. And I think yeah, the poems, um for some reason the poems are much closer to sort of my reality and my life.
Mm,
um
mhm,
you know, or things that I've seen. um Not to say that everything I've ever say in a poem is true, you know, like, but it's always much closer. um I feel like I'm a person who, there are writers who write both, where the fiction and the poetry is much closer to each other. I feel like I'm
mhm.
very, very far apart, both in subject matter, style, everything. um and yeah, I don't do any of those things that you notice, you know, like surreal and things that don't really happen. I rarely do that in poems, even though some people do it beautifully, but it just never even occurs. You know.
Right.
um and I wonder about that. I'm not sure. One thing is like, sometimes poems are just a little bit closer like to photographs, you know, like it's like a little
Mm,
thing.
mhm,
You know, that is just either beautiful or interesting or moving, and it's just that little thing, and that's the poem. You know.
mm.
um and fiction is a much sort of bigger into object, for me. um and I have to work, I have to work much, much harder on the fiction, as in like I really have to sort of, okay, let's do this. You know, whereas the poems, it's like, it sometimes it just happens, you know. The poetry is more natural to me.
Do you find that American readers respond to you in the sense that, oh, you're a Brazilian writer, you're a Latin
Mhm.
American writer, and then make assumptions about you because of that?
Yeah, so I think that definitely happens. I think, in all aspects of life, to most people who have some sort of minoritized status here. Um, the thing that makes it hard for me is that people do that, but I also talk a lot about my status as an immigrant in my poems, right? So it's like, I'm also calling the subject. So, but yeah, so because I'm talking about it, it's kind of like I start the conversation and it's a little bit more in my terms. You know what I mean? I'm saying this is what it's like. and it gives a little bit less room for people to go, oh, this is what it's like, you know. um yeah. um I think the book that I'm working on now, which is more the vision one, that is going to be very interesting because I have a lot of poems that have nothing to do with migration or anything like that. Um, and I'm just a lot of poems just about vision. Um, and I'm just wondering how that experience is going to be. I think it's going to be very different, because everybody uh, has a lot of aspects to themselves, right? And one of them is that, like, I'm a Brazilian writer, but then the vision thing, an American person can have it and I can have it. And it will be interesting to see how that is going to be talked about, um, when the poems are out, etc. But because for the stuff, like the book that is about to come out, um, I sort of start the conversation, sort of the subject matter is me who brought it up, you know, so it gets kind of tangled. In fiction, though, a lot of times, especially in the workshop context, nobody in my MFA, because my MFA was amazing and very full of people from everywhere. Um, but people ask like the silliest questions that you're just like, oh my god. Like, I don't know, I wrote a story about Brasilia, and Brasilia is like kind of like savanna, vegetation. It's like, grass and like short trees. It looks kind of like the picture you have of like Africa and the giraffe. It's like that kind of vegetation. It's a few trees and dry, and then there's the rainy season or whatever. But it's not like the jungle. There's different vegetations. And I'm writing a story about Brasilia, and the person goes, well, why don't you have some like lush, like tropical stuff? I'm like, there's no lush tropical stuff in there. What are you talking about? Little things like that. I think that sort of thing happens more, in places where I don't start the conversation, but surely it does happen. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, do you think that, you know, people sort of assume they know your story because they know where you came from? They make assumptions about what you must have experienced.
Yeah, I think there's a thing that I find super interesting, and it's one of those, there are experiences that you have when you just move out that are very, I don't know, like the naive experience when you're like a fresh person in the country. That's sort of fascinating and interesting. One of them is how the Brazilian, the Latino person or the Brazilian becomes one person. I'm like, it's a gigantic country. Brazil is huge. There's all sorts of people. Like, my experience is so different from somebody else's experience,
Right,
right? So,
right,
like, I think there's this whole merging of a whole country.
right.
And sometimes, yeah, sometimes it's, many times it'll be like, I don't know, like, I don't know, like I'm a, like, for example, like the nanny thing, right? Like, I'm with my son who looks like me, right? There's people
Oh,
who,
no
at least,
way.
like, the kid doesn't even look like them. And they're like, oh, are you an au pair? I'm like, first of all, I'm too old to be an au pair. Second of all, like, why would you think I'm the au pair? Stuff like that. That happens. Um, but so it's like, okay, the Brazilians are like sort of the baby, they turn the whole country into a person. And sometimes it's stuff like that, but sometimes it's also this, um goes the other way around. Oh, it comes with kindness. Sometimes it's like, oh, you guys are not like the Americans that do that. I'm like, no, no, no. There's plenty of people in Brazil doing all sorts of stuff, as evidenced by our president. It's because you're Brazilian, it doesn't mean that you are the good things and all the bad things. You're just a different person. In writing, yeah, it's hard. It's hard because you get little things all the time here and there, and it's a very mixed experience. Sometimes you get very insightful and great reactions, and sometimes you get silly things. And I think it's what happens in the publishing side, right? When you submit something, which is very relevant to what people will read eventually and who gets to tell the story. That we can know more by looking at numbers, right? So I don't know individually when I send a poem and it gets accepted or rejected. It could be that the poem's just bad, It could be that I'm a Brazilian person talking about something that doesn't fit whatever they like to hear from a Brazilian person. It's hard to tell. And these things, I feel like I've had a very great experience so far, but I feel these things more visible when you look at numbers, right? Like so many, the number of submissions and the number of things that get published, this kind of thing.
Sure.
Because it's hard to tell on an individual basis. Yeah.
It's interesting though, because, stories, I guess language in general, is really about classifying things, right? So you're trying to describe a character and you're trying to make the reader understand who that character is quickly.
Yes.
But at the same time, you run the risk of them not really understanding what you're saying. And it's almost like that's what you encounter as a Brazilian in America, that everybody is in a rush to try to understand you quickly. And as a writer, you kind of have to assist that, facilitate it, but at the same time, you don't want to betray your characters or your plot. Do you ever find that kind of thinking?
So I think you brought such a great point there, which is to create a character, right? You have to come up with a couple of characteristics to sort of form that person in the mind of the reader. And as much as you may want to give a big picture of the character, you always summarize in so much, right? And that's kind of like the job of the writer. And you're using whatever ideas are in the reader's brain, right? Which can lead to all sorts of things. So that's one thing that is sort of like problematic in an interesting way. The other one is sometimes your characters are the thing, like they're partially what the reader, I am Brazilian. I like X, Y, and Z. Like sometimes part of the stereotype applies, which makes it so hard because I'm like, it's just part of it. It's not the whole thing, but I do like this and that. Yeah, which is very complicated. The other thing, so these two things come together. Another thing that goes in, there's just so many things. Another thing that goes in there is like, let me just bring up the babysitter episode, right? Back. And that brings complications in America and in Brazil. So it's annoying that a person thinks I'm the au pair, right? But then there's like the au pair. What's wrong with being the au pair? And that everybody knows, but that is so charged in Brazil because the class distinctions are so strong there, right? So then there's a problematic side on the side of the person. There's a problematic, it evokes a problematic thing in Brazil, right? On the side of the person rejecting that label, perhaps.
Right.
So it's all very charged and very complicated, which is why I love writing that sort of calls attention calls attention to the fact that this writing is writing and that there are problems there. I don't think that every type of writing has to be that way. I enjoy regular stories very much, but I am very drawn to metafiction, autofiction, and writing that calls attention to the fact that this is being written by a writer and wakes you up to that fact and makes you question what the writer is doing. I don't think every writing should be like that, and it's not fun to just read that, but it's fun to put that into the mix, because I think this is one of the problem that you said of characterization. It's a problem that you kind of have to do it to write, but then people can investigate the problem in different ways, right?
Mm.
And I think that can be a genesis of much art, to investigate that problem.
Sure.
And one of the ways is like in metafiction or whatever, but there can be other ways. But it certainly is like an interesting problem.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, especially if you're writing about characters that will evoke a lot of stereotypes, right? Like sometimes you have to fight the stereotype, but then you're like, okay, am I writing this to fight that stereotype? Who am I writing that for?
Mhm. Right.
So it becomes very interesting, I think. Yeah.
It's almost like you become I remember another writer I spoke to a long time ago was talking about how you become the translator of your culture to,
Right.
you know, the Western or American, whatever reader. And then that becomes a pain in the neck,
Yeah.
because,
Yeah.
it kind of interferes. Well, that's not what the job I signed up for, right?
Right, exactly. You're not just writing the thing that you have to write, you're putting all these other things in there.
Right.
um
Yeah.
yes. Yeah. And I don't know, I think there's that, and also the translation job. I think that job, that type of translation, um brings a couple of things back. When I was talking about my childhood and how I had heard partial stories, right? Or when you go to a different country and you arrive and people have their things that everybody did in the 80s or whatever that I have no idea about. So I'm very surrounded by things that I don't know, that I have to look up, or I just have to guess from context. And I think that's true, very true of immigrants, and it's very true of marginalized people, because there's a central culture, right, that you have to sort of understand, um, to understand what's going on, like mainstream. Um, so I have a lot of joy and a high tolerance for reading something where I don't know what they're talking about in this part and in this part and this part, and I either look it up or I go, maybe it'll become clear later or whatever. And I actually enjoy the experience, maybe because of my life experience. Um, and I think, the the non-immigrant white American reader is also missing out, not having that experience, you know, um, because it's nice to sort of put it together slowly. It's kind of like an organic growth of the story in your mind versus sort of like just the staircase, it's like,
Mm.
um, and and um and I think it's an interesting thing to think about as a writer, um, how much to do both for the interference in your work, but also as a project, to see how much you can stretch it, and how can you make that experience happen without the translation? I think that can also be an interesting question. You just don't want to be forced to work on that question all the time, you know.
Right.
Yeah,
I want to talk to you a little about your poetry book, Amblyopia,
okay. Mhm.
and specifically about amblyopia, which is sort of a factor in your life and also coincidentally in my life.
Oh, that
Um,
was amazing.
so, it's commonly called lazy eye in this culture,
Yeah,
which is,
yeah,
could be a whole discussion in itself. But,
right.
you know, I wonder how you feel that, I mean, I know your son has a more serious case
Severe. Yeah,
than either of us did. But
right, right.
how does that sort of relate to your storytelling and to your perception of how things are and discovering yourself?
Nice. Yeah, I love that we had sort of a similar experience of it that we can talk about. Um,
Right.
so yeah, so the thing, the discovery with my son has, we knew when he was very young, like maybe one or just before one or something like that, that he had amblyopia. But the first person just sort of, the first person we saw didn't treat it as a big deal. I think, a lot of people have it like you and me. It's not such a massive thing. You just work on it. And it was just sort of, the diagnosis was more like, oh, he has myopia and he just wears glasses. It was a very simple thing. Um, the discovery of other things that amblyopia affects came recently to me, and it was sort of mind-blowing to me, because I have amblyopia. I didn't even know it was called amblyopia. I knew about the lazy eye, and I knew of the difference between my eyes, right? One sees much better than the other. um, and I remember sort of the doctor telling me this as a child. It was not treated as a big deal. We didn't do anything, just glasses. Um, my eye didn't turn uh, visibly and frequently like my son's. Um, so it wasn't a big deal. But I was always, okay, I have a lot of experiences of myself that I sort of thought were my personality. But what, what happened is, and I'll go into it in a second. What happened was, I went to the doctor. I went to this very good doctor who was recommended by another mom whose kid had amblyopia. And he did hours of testing, and it was much more thorough process than the first doctors that we saw with my son. Um, and he started describing all these side effects, like that are developmental. There are side effects from having this disparity in the eyes, and
Hmm.
how it affects binocular vision. So he was talking about all this stuff, and about sort of uh, having trouble with directions, not knowing where left and right are, and getting lost, and all these things. And he's describing it and being a little like, that's not the words he said, but a lot of sort of spacey side effects of it. And he's describing, I'm like, two reactions for every single thing he's saying. Either, wait, isn't everybody like that? Or,
Right.
or, oh, I thought that was just my quirky personality. You know what I mean? And it's describing all these things, and I'm having like this moment where, first of all, I'm like, wow, this thing about myself is part of, potentially, I'm not even sure, part of this. One. Two is, I probably gave it to him, so I feel very bad.
Mm.
Um, and then three, he has it much worse than me. So it was really affecting his reading. It was is a big deal for him. And you can tell in the numbers also, the correction I need is very small. The correction he needs is huge.
Mm.
Um, so I'm like feeling very sad, very guilty, um, but also feeling like it's just weird and marvelous that I'm discovering these things about myself and him. Um, and also the language of it is so like in your face. poetic language, right? Um, so I was already working with bilingual poems where sort of there's an internal struggle to what language is this poem in, and there's an integration thing going on. Like I want this to be one poem with the two languages, not two poems, and I'm fighting to integrate them. So I was already doing that, and then the doctor's going through the explanation of the condition more thoroughly, and he's saying, one eye is fighting the other eye, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's a poem. And there's a convergence problem, like converging the two images together,
Right.
and that worked so much. And then I felt like, oh my gosh, this is wonderful, but then I felt guilty about thinking about that. It was just like an explosion of things happening at those moments. And that this chapbook has a lot of things that I was working through, at both at the discovery, and also there's a lot of work to be done with him. So we do like this therapies, and then we do it with the therapist once a week, but then I have to do it every single day with him. I also help with reading. So there was a lot of both sort of labor and also just sort of things to work through. So I think that book was very helpful for me. I'm still working on other poems related to that, but I think they don't have the immediacy. This was sort of the immediate reaction of that time that was really crazy. Yeah,
It's
yeah,
funny because it's like, the same way that as a writer, you kind of have to assume that the world is as you see it and that everybody
yeah,
sees the world the way you do,
yeah,
then suddenly you have that assumption changed, and it's like
yeah.
all of these assumptions that we make based on our experience of living in the same body and the same reality every day, you just assume it's
That
everybody's reality, right?
that's totally right. It really was sort of like mind blowing, because it was that, and it was also what I knew about myself, like I've lived this way all this time,
Right.
and I just didn't know anything about it. It was just very, very crazy. I was like, wow. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, yeah. So a lot of those came through that, and it worked very well with the work that I was doing before.
Uh-huh.
Um, yeah, because I was doing a lot of these uh, experiments of putting them together, and one of them is using repeating forms in poetry. So like a pantoum or something is a poem that will repeat the lines. So instead of repeating the lines, I putting a repetition, I was putting translations, but the translations were very loose. Um,
Mm,
so that worked very well with Amblyopia stuff. Yeah,
got it. Well,
yeah.
I've had a wonderful time talking to you, and I feel like we could talk for another hour, but I know
Thank you so much.
we
That,
both
that
have
that was
things to
really
do,
wonderful.
and but I really appreciate your time and your insight. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was really wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. The Story Talks Back is produced and hosted by Dave Stanton. The music you're hearing now was written and performed by Christopher Daydream. The theme music at the beginning of our show is an excerpt from Play by Merlin Twelfhoven, performed by Kronos Quartet as part of their 50 for the Future series. Please subscribe to The Story Talks Back on Podbean and check us out on Instagram. See you next time.